on the map, you walk past the English building. I'm like, we all know this.
Yeah.
We literally all know this.
Yeah, there's certain things, if you don't know them by now, you are never going to.
We had the Department of Public Safety around here, like the campus safety camps.
You can't come speak to them?
Yeah, she was just like, we're active like 24 hours and like supposed to be managing the phones.
Oh my gosh, in Canada, it's Thanksgiving.
Today, so like tonight it's 7 minutes.
Well, their growing season is shorter. Okay, so everybody just take a few minutes, look over the handout that I just gave you, and when you're done looking at it, or as you're looking at it, if you have questions, right, please do ask. But what I've just given you is the main assignment sheet for paper 1.
Can we go over the complete assignment 5? Because I know like some people are confused, and so like people are asking like any questions, so like I can also.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, we can go over that, but yeah, just give this a look first. And we'll get to that.
So is the draft due on Wednesday and the actual paper due Monday?
Yes. But yeah, remember again, by tonight you'll have about half the word count of the paper, and Wednesday we will be working on it in class. So,
oh my gosh.
Yes.
So are we going to write this little half that's due tonight, and then on Wednesday we're going to fluff it up a little, not fluff it up, just add to it, and then are we rewriting it all over again to make it 1,500 words?
So at each stage, I am going to be giving you feedback, right? And I do expect you to do some revision based on the feedback, right? But the point I'm trying to make is that like you're not going to be starting from scratch each time, right? You know, you're already going to have material to work with. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
How many paragraphs would you say is 1,500 words?
If we're looking about, that's probably
like 40.
yeah, it's about, that's going to be 4 or 5 pages double spaced, so probably about 8 or 9 paragraphs.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Paragraphs by,
Yeah. Generally speaking, a good paragraph is going to be about half a page long.
Wait, we can write on this, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, just look it over and see if you have any questions.
When we print out our paper, it sounds like weird, but do you want it like obviously double spaced? Do you want it like front and back, or do you want it like, you know what I mean?
Oh, you don't actually have to print it out.
Oh, I thought we had to print out.
No, you're just going to submit it to Georgia.
Oh, I didn't know if you wanted us to have a hard copy.
Nope. Yes.
Monday, not Wednesday.
The paper itself is due Monday, a week from today, right?
Yeah, drafts.
Did I? Or wait, what did I put? Oh, yeah, these aren't even. I didn't even count this right. Yeah, I double check this every semester, and I always fuck up some date or other. Okay, so yeah, so you will have, because this says Wednesday, you will have till next Wednesday to complete the final paper.
Yeah, the final paper's due the 21st, right?
Yeah. So yeah, a week from Wednesday. Because I figured I'd give you a little bit more time with that, because there's not going to be time to factor the final paper in your midterm grade anyway, right? This assignment will factor in, the draft will factor in, and just to be clear too, for the draft, to get full credit for the draft, all you have to do is turn something in that meets the requirements, right? That isn't plagiarized. As long as the draft is complete, I give you full credit for it. I will grade the paper qualitatively.
So it's like draft Wednesday, paper the next Wednesday?
Yeah.
Okay.
That is correct.
have a test. Wait,
No, this is a writing class. I don't I don't think there are people who do exams in composition classes. I don't think that an exam tells me anything useful about what you can do.
Because I've been waiting for the day where you're like,
Yeah.
test. You know everything about me.
No, we do plenty of formal and informal writing. There's no need for a test in a class like this. Okay, so everybody had a chance to look at this? Everybody clear on what to do, more or less? Yes, Carmen. Okay, so the main thing that you're doing for assignment 5 is selecting one of your reflection papers and further developing it, right? So I want you to try to use the template in the textbook that they're calling 10 on 1. You don't have to find 10 things to say about the one thing, right? The basic point is, though, that like what you're doing is a close analysis of a single thing, right? You're finding more things to say about that one quote you've selected than trying to cover too much ground, right? Yeah. I'm sorry, I didn't quite hear you.
Last time you told us to choose one of the papers and basically do that.
Yeah.
Do we do that again to a different one or do that again to the same one?
Can you pick whichever reflection paper you want?
Yeah, you can pick. You've done 3 reflection papers so far, right? So you're going to pick one and stick with it, and that's the one that we're going to be working on throughout this process, right?
So the one that I did that to last time, do it again, basically.
Yeah. So what you're doing for the reflection paper is you're picking a single quote, right? Where you think there's some kind of that you think is exemplary of some kind of important pattern in the whole text, right? What you're doing as you draw out for the longer paper is showing me the rest of that pattern, right? So show me the other pieces that this quote is part of, right? Of the pattern that this quote is part of. Does this make sense? Does everybody understand?
There's something.
Okay, so where am I losing you?
I'm not really like lost. It's just like how do we just go off like with one quote? Because like you can only talk about one quote for so long.
Well,
So
and,
like,
mhm.
I don't know.
Yeah. Well, and you will actually, if you try to pay close attention to one thing and draw all the possible implications out of the language, you will actually find that you have more to say most of the time than if you try to cover the whole paper, right? Or if you try to cover the whole text. So if you try to give me like something that covers the entire text and everything in it, you're just going to end up with a summary, right? Because you're trying to cram all the information in. You're not spending enough time on one thing to develop an argument. So what you need to do is make sure that the quote that you're looking at is part of a larger pattern that you've already identified, right? Something that you can connect to other pieces of the text. So, like, for example, when we're talking about Rachel Carson, and there was, her thing wasn't about war, right? But she was talking about, the way we use pesticides in the environment in terms of, war and battle, right? So what you would do is you would take a pattern like that and think about, okay, what is this doing here? And why is she using this particular kind of language in this context? Does this make sense?
And we can use as many like other resources outside of like read the law or whatever that we want, right? Like we can use other resources.
I'd rather you didn't really use other resources for this. We're going to be doing a research paper at the end of the semester.
Okay.
And we'll talk then about what kinds of resources are appropriate for a paper.
So you're gonna say like don't use any of the resources at all?
I would say so in terms of the stuff that I gave you on Georgia, you can look over some of that stuff, particularly if you feel like you don't adequately understand what you're reading. But I wouldn't use it as sources in the paper. So what I'd say is anything that I gave you on Georgia, you can treat that information as common knowledge. Since it is something that I specifically shared with you. Just don't go like lifting quotes verbatim from it.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Okay. Right. Y'all can do this, right? You have been showing me over the course of the term that you are capable of this, and you know, I have no doubt, particularly as we divide this up into small chunks, I have no doubt that all of you can complete this, right? Yes?
Is this our biggest assignment? We're doing like 2,000.
There's going to be a paper that's going to be about 2,500 to 3,000 words at the end of the semester, but that's going to be a research paper where you will be quoting from secondary sources, right?
And that's like the final.
Yeah, that'll be the final assignment. Yeah, so we're going to spend a good bit of time working on it. We're going to do that in stages as well, and you know, remember again too that a lot of that word count is going to be quotation from secondary sources, right? That'll make up for a lot of the extra verbiage. Okay. Other questions? Okay. Then what I want to cover today is thesis development. Because as I think I said this last time, this seems to be historically the thing that my students have had the most trouble with. So when you are writing a paper, what do you usually start with? What's that?
Brief over the topic of what you're going to be expecting.
Okay. So yeah, first thing you got to do is pick a topic, right? You've got your topic selected, right? What do you usually do first? Come up with your arguments or examine your sources? Pardon?
Is it examining your sources?
That's what you ought to be doing first, yes. Examining your sources is the way you ought to be doing this, right? You ought to be generating your argument from the data, rather than starting with an argument that's already formed in your head and trying to impose it on the data, right? So, let me just say, by the way, how glad I was to hear you say that. Okay, so here's what a good thesis does, generally speaking, right? So good thesis, put everything in good thesis and bad thesis. So we'll talk about what each of these does, and then we'll run through a couple of examples of weak thesis statements so that you can recognize what sorts of things not to do, right? So a good thesis connects a single main idea to useful evidence. A bad thesis tries to cover too much ground, right? A bad thesis tries to cover everything and thus ends up being vague. Right, whereas a good thesis is making a specific argument about specific evidence, right? A good thesis can lead you to new ideas about the evidence you're examining. A bad thesis locks you into a vague or overly simplistic idea, right? Because again, if you're trying to cover everything rather than something specific, you can't help but be vague, right? A good thesis also kind of provides direction, right? It shows you what your next step should be. So a good thesis maybe tells you what to look at next. A bad thesis provides no clear next steps, right? It doesn't forecast any particular direction it's going to go in. So to give you some examples of what a bad thesis looks like, right, or a weak thesis, what I'm going to do, I'm going to write a thesis up on the board, and you're going to tell me what's wrong with it, okay? And then we're going to try to figure out how to fix it. So first example. Despite many ups and downs, the movement for women's suffrage in the United States was successful. And before we continue, there was one thing that I did forget to note here. That a thesis needs to be arguable in 3 senses of that word, right? It has to be arguable in that 1, it must be supported by evidence. 2, it must be something with which another reader could disagree. Right? That is, it has to be an interpretation based on evidence, right? Remember that a claim is always an interpretation. And a thesis is essentially your paper's big claim, right? And 3, it must take a position on your topic, right? You know, no wishy-washy, there are pros and cons to blah, blah, blah bullshit, right? You have to take a firm position on the topic. So, with all this in mind, right, what is wrong with this particular thesis statement?
It doesn't specify what like the ups and downs are.
Okay, yeah, that's vague, right? What are these ups and downs? What do they have to overcome? Is there a bigger problem with this, though? Successful. Okay, successful. What does successful mean, right? Successful is a very subjective term. Is there anything else that's wrong with this? If we think about this in terms of being arguable. What's that?
Could it be arguable?
Yeah, is this actually arguable?
No, because it was successful.
Yeah, it's not arguable as stated, right? I mean, yeah, I mean, you know, what was the goal of the women's suffrage movement? Yeah, and can you all vote?
Yeah.
Right. So there's the problem with this is, at least as stated, right? This is a statement of facts. It's not really something that's up for debate. And I think that y'all were already looking at some ways we might actually fix this, right? I think, you know, one of you was questioning the term successful here, right? So, okay, well, what does that mean? And, you know, one thing that you might do is look at something that the movement didn't do successfully, right? Look for some kind of complicating factor within the history here, right? So, did the women's suffrage movement in the early 20th century immediately get all women the right to vote? Yeah, women of color were largely left out, right? So there's a complicating factor there, right? So one could make the argument that the women's suffrage movement of the early 20th century succeeded in getting white women to vote by largely leaving black women out of the movement, right? Now, then you've got something that is arguable, right? You've identified a specific problem, or a particular question to ask and taken a position on it, right? And, you know, I'm just providing an example here. I'm not saying whether any particular position is right or wrong, right? This is... So, let's try another example. In this paper, I will examine whether Hamlet is actually insane or is just playing a part. What's that? Okay, what? And you know, just beyond like the fact that it's formally a little bit annoying, right? Why wouldn't you start within this paper?
Because I feel like obviously you're right about it. Like there's no need to say that in this paper.
Sure.
When you're clearly saying like what the topic's going to be next, you know what I mean?
Yeah, and I think, but it's also often an indicator of something else that this statement isn't doing. What is this writer avoiding doing here? What does a thesis need to do in order to be arguable? What's that? Yeah, it's got to take a position, right? The problem with this, and often if you know, when you see this in this paper formulation, right, it's usually followed by a fairly flat explanation of what generally the paper is going to be about, right? But there's no argument here. The writer fails to take a position. So this would actually have a fairly easy fix, right? What would you have to do? What's that?
Word, take the in this paper out, move the I, pick a side.
Pick a side would be the most important thing you have to do, right? Yeah, the in this paper, like it's annoying, but it's not crucial, right? The crucial problem here is that the writer's not taking a side. So yeah, that would be the big thing that would need to be fixed, right? Is Hamlet crazy, or is he just playing a part? And I just want to say that he says in the play dozens of times that he's just playing a part, so there's plenty of evidence that that's his. But I digress. Okay. In Titanic, Jack sacrifices his life for Lily, or Rose. I don't know why I always want to call her Lily.
I was like, what?
It's still flowers.
Yeah. Because true love conquers all. Oh, puke, right?
It's just like stating a fact, or what he thinks is fact is not like taking a firm position.
That's an opinion.
Okay. It's an opinion, yeah, it's not, what pardon?
I said a big opinion.
Uh-huh.
It's a lie.
Well, yeah, okay.
True love does not pay
Well, yeah, but like when we see a phrase like "true love conquers all," right? Is this something we've heard before?
Yeah.
A million fucking times in a million fucking different places? Yeah. There's no originality in this idea, right? It's a cliche. Do we all know what a cliche is? Pardon?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, it's one of those. Yeah, you know it when you see it, right? But it's hard to explain, right?
Something believed by most that could be hard.
It's like something being repeated, like something that's always being said.
Yeah, it's something that dozens of people have said, right, over time, over and over and over again. so that any freshness or originality has been drained out of the idea, right? And it's just a formula people use now to avoid having to have an original thought. So what you would need to do here to fix this is question the conventional wisdom in some way, right? How is Jack's, dying in the icy waters of the North Atlantic, maybe not an example of true love? What's that? Okay. Perhaps, because he's willing to end their relationship in that way, right?
But when he was on that thing, he she was saying she loved him, and then he was like, "This is not goodbye."
Yeah. I mean, it kind of looked like goodbye to me, but.
But it was sweet though. He was like telling her.
Sure, but and I think we're actually going to develop this a little bit when we start talking about how to develop a thesis. But one thing that is particularly interesting here, at least to me, is why does it have to be him that dies? Yeah. So what this actually tells us is something about the value system of the movie, I think, and which character the movie considers more valuable, whether it clearly states this or even realizes it's doing this. Right?
Especially since when she's older, she's saying how it happened. Obviously, obviously Rose is the main character, but I also thought of it he sacrificed himself because I felt back in the day men would put the women first if they truly love them. You know what I mean?
Okay, so yeah, we can actually probably see this as part of a pattern of expected masculine behavior in the movie, right? Yeah, you can connect this maybe to the men giving up because there aren't enough lifeboats for everybody in a boat that's supposed to be unsinkable.
A woman telling a story is a different effect than a man telling a story. A woman telling her.
Sure.
It makes it more of a chick flick.
Okay. But yes, so what we're doing here is finding ways to question the cliche, right? We're finding ways to question the conventional wisdom of this statement by looking closely at other elements of the movie, right? Okay. Next to last example of this.
That wasn't a good example, right?
That was an example of a bad thesis, yes. So if you write a thesis statement out and it sounds like something you've heard a million times before, start questioning it. Right?
So avoid cliches.
Avoid cliches, yes. All right. Marijuana should be legalized everywhere.
I feel it's either it should be legalized everywhere or it shouldn't. You can't. I feel it's.
Hold on, let it decide.
I feel it's capped.
Let me finish. Let me finish. Marijuana should be legalized everywhere.
Yes. No.
Since keeping it illegal violates my individual rights.
Negative.
Remember, this is an example of a bad thesis, right?
Yeah.
So what's bad about this?
Why are you stating your individual rights?
You're contradicting yourself.
Yeah, that is your opinion.
Okay, yeah, that's right. It is just my opinion, right? This isn't based on anything but my own personal convictions. Yeah.
I believe
Exactly. So yeah, one way you can detect this in your own writing is if you find yourself writing "I feel" or "I believe," right? Then you're probably arguing from conviction rather than from evidence, right?
What individual right are they talking about? Because that's not clear. But if you're trying to argue that, you should at least be specific.
Sure. Yeah. So again, what you would need to do here if you wanted to make this argument, right, is provide some evidence that marijuana legalization would lead to some kind of good outcome that you could argue for, right? Something other than not infringing on your concept of your individual rights, right? All right. Last one. The French Revolution set the people free from tyranny.
It's just stating it back. Or taking it back.
Well, this is actually a little different from a statement of fact, right? This is something that probably is a little bit more arguable if we look at the actual history of the French Revolution.
I feel like it's so broad.
No, I don't know enough about history to argue.
Yeah, I don't
Okay.
either, but I feel like it's just like,
We know our history teachers did a bad job. We know.
Well, and, you know, I was thinking about this. Like, I actually want to take back some of the criticisms that I made of your high school teachers because I'm realizing now that the last 2 years of high school were completely not normal for most of you.
Yeah.
And that in terms of where your knowledge level is, this isn't your fault or necessarily the teacher's fault, but like I realize that I'm basically teaching 11th graders rather than normal college freshmen. So, you know, and this is not this is not meant to denigrate you, right? This is just, you know, a realization that I had the other day.
So
yeah,
in 2018 and 2019, though, I had no excuse. I had no excuse.
Anyway, so I think we were kind of on the right track about what's wrong with this. Like, what makes it seem just kind of blah?
There's no like information behind it. Like,
Yeah.
it's just like, it's just people who come
It's
free.
not supported. It can't be supported.
Yeah. It's too big, right?
Like, it's just like that.
Yeah. It's vague and it's too broad, right? So you would need to come up with some specific definitions here, right? You would have to, for example, decide what exactly tyranny means, right?
Say that one time.
You would have to decide what exactly tyranny means, right?
So no. That's why I asked him to say it again. I was like, huh?
Well, you know, my wife does that all the time. To be like she reads words that she's never actually heard spoken, and then yeah. So this is one of those for you, right? Yeah. But yeah, it is pronounced. I know that tyrant is, you know, a person who practices tyranny, right? But yeah, tyranny is how you pronounce the word. But yeah, you would have to interrogate what this means, right? And demonstrate whether, you know, forms of control instituted by the revolution were better or worse than what existed before it, right? You could make the case for something like that, but just making a broad blanket statement like to set the people free from tyranny, right? Well, what the hell does that even mean, right? One more thing you want to look for in your own thesis statements as you're writing. If your thesis looks like a list, what are you probably doing?
Writing about things.
Yeah, okay. It's probably, a list is generally not a good thesis, right? It shows you're falling back into that 5-paragraph trap, right? That it's, you know, okay, it's like I'm going to have my introduction, my conclusion that repeats the introduction, and my 3 body paragraphs on these 3 topics, right? What you need to do if you find yourself making a kind of list thesis is think about what the logical connection is between the things on the list. That's what your real argument is about, not the list itself. Right? You probably chose those 3 things for a reason. Figure out what that reason is and you can develop a thesis from there, right? Okay.
Can you do like an example so like I can like see it? Because like I know like I've done that in the past, so like I'm not good at visual person. So.
Okay, so you want an example of like what the list thesis looks like,
Like I know what it looks like, but
and
how
you want an
like,
example of a good thesis.
Really good.
Okay, we're gonna get there. We're gonna get there, I promise.
like how you like change from like your list to like the to like a good thesis. You know what I mean?
Okay, so let me try. I do not. Let me think about what's.
Hold on. So like, if I write out a thesis and like there's no list, like,
Uh-huh.
can I just like take out like the list and then just put a
But if
period
you're
in
like
and
talking
that's
about
my
one
thesis?
particular thing and just the things that are like connected to it as you go along, you shouldn't really leave a list.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So.
Don't like be like, I'm gonna talk about this. He's saying like he's building.
Alright, I got it.
Yeah, just go ahead and tell me what the connecting logic is, right? And why that matters. That's your thesis, not the list itself. Yep. Okay, so in terms of actually developing a thesis here, right, from evidence. So I gather from earlier conversation that most of you have seen Titanic, right?
It's back on Netflix. I have not.
That's just great. Okay. See, I use this as an example. I don't particularly like the movie myself, but it is it's something that almost everyone usually has seen. So it makes for an easy subject for analysis.
What's your favorite movie? Like all the movies you can watch, that's your favorite?
Okay, so what I want to do here is take a quick look at our two main protagonists, right? Draw out some of their characteristics and see if there's something in there that we can build an argument with. Because, you know, what is the movie essentially about? What's that?
A love story.
Yeah, it's really more a love story than anything else, right? Yeah, the boat sinks. Right, there's that particular historical event. I'm sorry if you didn't know that's how it ends. But that's really more a backdrop to this love story, right? And I think one thing that's important to consider about this love story that is essentially a kind of recovered memory, right? Mm-hmm. So the movie starts.
Isn't Titanic like 3 hours long?
Yeah, it's really it feels longer. But it starts with a salvage operation, right? You've got these guys that have found these guys running this kind of archaeological mission, who are unearthing these things from the ship, right? That okay, we found these things. Let's contact some people to who these things are connected, right? And they get in touch with this woman Rose, and then it becomes largely about recovery of her memories, right? So it is a movie that is on some level about recovery and remembrance. So let's look at the two characters at the center of the love story that's remembered here. Let's look at Jack first. Okay, yeah, he's
Lower class.
Yes, lower socioeconomic status, right? Right, poor kid, drifter. What else do we know about him?
You want us to get like parking?
Yeah, he's there by chance, right? He didn't buy his ticket, he wanted in the poker game. Some prize, right? What else do we know about this character?
He's an artist.
He's an artist.
Oh yeah, thank you.
Yes, he's an artist. What's that?
Wasn't he like a teen?
He's like 19.
Yeah, I mean,
Or like younger.
Yeah, these are characters who are in their late teens or early 20s, or probably late teens.
I think they said Rose was like 17.
Yeah.
What?
Well, you know, like 1912. You know, if you're not married by 17, you're already approaching old maid status, right? So yeah, that's one thing. Yeah, these are characters who are very young, right? What else do we know about Jeff? Let's try to pick him apart a little bit.
He's from America.
Okay, he's American. What was that?
It was a joke. I said Leonardo DiCaprio.
Okay, yeah.
Always plays the guy in Hamlet. It's always weird.
What about his personality? Okay.
Charming.
I would say charming and outgoing.
Funny, charming, right, outgoing. Okay.
Smart. He's pretty smart.
And does he have any attachments?
Oh, didn't he like? He had nothing.
Yeah.
He had like nothing.
Yeah. He has no family,
Yeah, nothing.
no friends, nothing really, right? Is basically free. What about Rose? Let's move on to Rose here. What is Rose
Upper
like?
class.
Upper class. Okay, yeah, upper class.
She's trapped in a relationship with an abusive man.
Okay, yes.
Didn't she have a
Supposed to be
boyfriend?
married off.
Yes, it's worse than that, right? She's engaged to a real piece of shit, right?
Yep.
Yes, she's engaged to a wealthy turd.
Suicide.
Yeah, yeah, or at least momentarily.
Wasn't she like in a job or something?
In fact, that's how they end up meeting, right? Is that he talks her down.
Yeah.
But the only reason, like, I don't think she loved him, but they're like, her family was going broke, and her mom was pressuring her to marry him so they could have.
Oh yeah, she didn't love him.
Okay, yeah, so she's under a good deal of social pressure, right?
Not free.
Yeah, not free.
Just kind of shy.
Okay, a little bit more introverted. Yeah, I think we could probably stick that under social pressure, that she is not just attached, but very much embedded, right, in this social system, right? And she's British, right?
Yes.
Okay, so I think this gives us enough material to work with. And as I look over this stuff, I think that the thing that I'm most interested in is the class angle. So I'm going to use that as my interpretive lens, right? So I'm thinking about the class difference between these two characters, and how likely is it that these two would meet and get together on land?
Never.
Probably would never encounter each other, right? So my first working thesis after looking at this evidence is going to look something like this, right? In Titanic, the ship is a special world in which class differences
What kind of ship? What kind of ship was it? Was it like a cargo ship? Like what?
No, it was more like a cruise ship, an enormous cruise ship. Yeah. In fact, there are scholars of the history of engineering who argue that it was actually a good thing the Titanic sank, because if it hadn't, like the people who built the Titanic took a lot of shortcuts.
Yeah.
And if it hadn't sunk and had made it across the Atlantic, maybe even for multiple voyages, then it would have encouraged other shipbuilders to keep building bigger ships out of cheaper materials with less oversight and regulation, and eventually would have led to a bigger disaster. But I digress.
Probably like free.
So here we have a working thesis, right? This is the initial idea that I come up with that seems to account for at least some of my evidence here, right? So what I then need to do is keep applying more evidence to this to try to refine and shape it, right? So Jack and Rose, despite their different social classes, are able to come together, right? Does this necessarily mean in the movie that class difference doesn't matter?
No.
How can I tell that it actually does matter a good deal?
They're just like separate. Like even on the ship, like
Mm-hmm.
you know, you got upper class and things that the lower class wouldn't. They're more like privileges.
Yeah.
Well, like lower
Yeah.
class wasn't allowed, like so far up. because the upper class don't allow.
Yeah, that's, yeah. So Jack is only able to meet Rose by breaking the ship's rules, right? So it seems like actually the ship's rules enforce existing class differences, right? So I can revise this slightly now in light of that. Right, so while Jack and Rose, while Jack and Rose pursue a cross-class romance, they can only do so by breaking the class codes enforced by the ship. Now, I think I can probably take this a little further as well. If we look at the respective fates of Jack and Rose, right? Who lives and who dies?
Rose lives.
Yeah, Rose lives, Jack dies, right? So this suggests that maybe the movie values the rich girl more than it values the poor boy, right?
Didn't you say that like the thesis should kind of go like at the end, right? That it kind of get it bring it all together.
So the most developed form of your thesis is now going to come at the end, right?
Right.
So you'll have a working thesis at the beginning of the paper. But yeah, what you're going to be doing, and I'll explain a little bit more about this in a minute, what you're going to be doing is in each paragraph applying more evidence to your thesis and thus developing it and moving it along, right? That's the process I'm trying to show you right now.
Basically, like going more in depth. So you can like throughout each paragraph.
Yeah, essentially, yeah, each paragraph is going to take you a little bit deeper and is going to make your thesis a little bit more specific, right? So you want to think about the basic shape of the paper as being like a funnel.
Okay.
You start with a relatively broad but arguable thesis, right? And then in each paragraph, as you apply evidence, you refine it and you make it more specific. So, where was it? So we've got like, okay, so the movie seems to value the rich girl more than the poor, but it lets her live, and it's about her memories, right? It's about recovering her memories. So, do we see other signs in the movie that maybe it values rich people more than poor people? What happens to the poor passengers when the ship starts to sink?
They don't get. Oh, the upper class gets the votes first.
Yeah.
Or the whatever for the
Yeah, and the poor get locked down in steerage, right? Yeah, they're barred from going to the upper decks at all to get on the lifeboats, even though they also know the boat is sinking. Whereas the rich men in particular, the rich are either given chances to help lead the rescue, right? Or to heroically sacrifice their places. So, we come up...
Sinking, they say women and children first.
What's that?
When the ship is sinking, they do say women and children first.
Right, but not the poor women and children in this this case, right? In fact, we specifically see a scene in which an Irish immigrant mother is tucking her children in, knowing that they're all going to drown, right?
Wasn't there like part of the movie where there was like the guy that tried to take the boat from
Yeah. I remember the actor is Billy Zane. I don't remember the character's name.
But I remember he like pushed him out of the way to try to get the boat. Or something.
He pretends to have, he threatens a kid. Yeah, he basically pretends she's his child. Yeah. In order to get into the boat. So he seems to be an exception, though, right?
Yeah.
That.
There's always those guys, though.
Yeah. So.
Wait, so are we revising this?
Yeah, we're revising this again, right? So we're thinking about this so that, by offering opportunities for heroism, to the wealthy, and letting the poor remain passive victims, Titanic enforces the class stereotypes it tried to resist in the love story plot. And one thing that you probably notice about the more complicated versions of my thesis, or the more developed versions of the thesis, is that most of them are two clauses, right? Each of which kind of contains a slightly different idea. This is actually a good way to compose a thesis statement, right? What you want to do is have a main idea that you're arguing for, and then some other idea that you're reacting against in the thesis, right?
So it's good to have two clauses.
Yeah, exactly. So something like, while Titanic may appear to resist class difference, in fact, the structure of the movie enforces existing class divides, right? Something like that, where, what the movie seems to be doing or seems to think it's doing is the idea you're reacting against, right? Does this make sense? Okay. So this is what I want to see you trying to do in your papers, right? Think of what you're doing here as being almost like applying the scientific method to writing. Does everybody know how the scientific method works?
Yes.
Okay. Prove to me that you know. Explain it to me.
Well, first you're going to observe what you read. So basically you're going to take out what you read.
Okay.
Then you're going to question it.
Yep.
And then you're going to come up with a hypothesis.
Yes.
Basically, here's a new thesis.
Uh-huh.
And then you're going to come up with an experiment to test your hypothesis.
Yeah.
And then you're going to... I'm a college major. This morning. And then, that's basically it.
Yeah. And
it has to be testable by other sources.
Yeah.
Good job.
Very good. Thank you. Yes. Thank you for that. So yeah, you're following basically the same process when you're writing a paper. You're making observations, right? You're going to formulate a question based on those observations, right? Okay, why is this doing this? Your hypothesis is going to be your proposed answer to the question, right? So your original thesis. And then you're going to test your thesis by continually applying evidence to it, right? And then in your conclusion, and we'll talk a little bit more about introductions and conclusions maybe at the beginning of class next time before you all sit down and start writing. Your conclusion is going to include the most developed, specific, qualified form of your thesis, right?
In conclusion, would you like to restate your thesis? thesis, but like in different words, right?
If you're restating your thesis and it hasn't really moved or changed at all, then you probably haven't really done this, right? So your thesis shouldn't be substantially different from what it started out as, but it should be more specific and more refined, right? So again, like think about the process that we just did here, right? We've got a more developed form here of the original idea. So that's what you're going to be giving me in the conclusion. Okay, I think it's probably about okay. So this was really all I wanted to do with y'all today. Does anybody have any questions about it? Yeah,
I
Hannah.
have a question that's not, it's related to the paper, but not really this.
Okay.
I had a really hard time to ask rhetorical questions in the paper.
You have a real habit of doing that.
Yeah. So could you give me like a good way to avoid that?
Okay, everybody knows what a rhetorical question is, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so rhetorical questions are going to drive your instructors nuts because they usually look like a way you're trying to dodge having to answer something, right? It's like, I'm just going to put a question in here and I don't really have to answer it, right? You know, they just crazy. So what you want to do, instead of writing the question, try to rephrase it as an affirmative statement, right? What would the statement form of your rhetorical question look like, right? What is the answer to your rhetorical question? And give me that instead. Yeah, I've noticed here, I think particularly, I've noticed it particularly from students who come from certain kinds of evangelical Protestant backgrounds here. It's probably something that is prominent in sermons and things like that.
Yep.
Okay, yeah. I've noticed that in a lot of papers down here, more so than when I taught in the East.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right.